fit in with the general overall framework which we've been dealing with. I am going to talk a bit about Plan A and a bit about looking down the next few years beyond Plan A, but I would like to spend my first 30 seconds of my 15 minutes, in any case, endorsing Plan B. And the reason I want to do that is simply because I think the main enemy is Tina, poor Tina. There is no alternative. I think that this is the major justification which has been given for Plan A, and that the difference between various political forces, both in this state and at the European level, has been between those who have been enthusiastically implementing Plan A and those who've been regretfully implementing Plan A on the grounds that there is no alternative, though they might wish that there was one. And the consequence of believing that there is no alternative, of course, is simply then that there is no point in campaigning against Plan A or indeed seeking that alternative. I'm going to propose instead that there is no alternative to an alternative, T-I-N-A-T-A, Tinata, and the reason that there is no alternative to an alternative is because of the character of the historical era in which we find ourselves. I'm going to ask your indulgence and do a little bit of economic history here and put the Irish crisis in retrospect. And I want to start with some American statistics, simply because the American statistics are much better than the Irish statistics. It wouldn't be possible to do this chart using Irish data because the Irish data don't exist. This is stolen from a website called Calculated Risk. They're basically one of these hedge fund companies. But they do a rather good service by updating this on a regular basis. And what we have here is the percent job losses in post-World War II recessions. And all of the previous post-World War II recessions are over here on the left-hand side. That is, you start with no losses, the recession hits, and then jobs are lost. You hit the bottom of the recession, and then there's a recovery of jobs, and eventually, say you follow this yellow line here, eventually you return to the previous level of employment. And what we see here is that in all previous recessions, well under 4 years, by about the third year, and by about the second year, if we leave out the 2001 recession, the economy has in fact recovered. The red line is the current employment recession. It's much deeper than previous recessions in the United States, and it's not over yet after 5 years. To borrow from the Oldsmobile ad in the United States, this is not your father's recession. Okay, this is something other than a standard recession. When has this happened before? Well, it has happened a number of times before. The Long Depression in the late 19th century, the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Great Stagflation in the 1970s, and then we can put the current Great Recession in this context. The Long Depression at the end of the 19th century was essentially the crisis of competitive capitalism. And the response was the reorganization of both the economy and the society around the change in the market structure, a transition to monopoly capitalism. And it's that monopoly capitalism which went into crisis in the 1930s. The response was a reorganization of both the economy and the culture around a Keynesian program, sometimes referred to as the New Deal order in the context of the United States. That Keynesian capitalism went into crisis in the early 1970s. The response was global neoliberalism. What we're facing now is a crisis of global neoliberalism, and the response is more global neoliberalism. Okay, what is wrong with this picture? Okay, nobody has ever gotten out of a previous long crisis in capitalism by intensifying the institutional structure which got us into that crisis. Okay, it simply doesn't work. It's not possible. It's occasionally tried, and all that happens is the crisis deepens. Plan A. It is the intensification of global neoliberalism. Plan A involves cutting wages, eliminating labor protections, cutting social services, selling state enterprises, shrinking public employment, restricting the money supply, and relying on export surpluses to get us out of the current impasse. The problem is the roller coaster has collapsed. That is, levering the cars back onto the tracks, however effectively one might do it, is not going to solve the problem. In addition, we're facing a crisis which can not only be analyzed in terms of the depth of time, but is also one which is taking place on several geographical scales. We're facing a global crisis, we're facing a Eurozone crisis, and we're facing an Irish crisis. And the three crises are in fact nested, one within the other. What do we do to address the crisis? The first thing I think we need to do is recognize that there is no magic bullet. Basically, there is no one clever intervention or even one set of clever interventions which is going to resolve this crisis. In order to gain some perspective on what ultimately needs to be done, and again, I want to endorse Plan B in the context of the next couple of years, but we need to look beyond this, simply because major structural crises in the capitalist world system have never been resolved without major structural change. So what is it which is at the foundation of this major crisis? Well, some of the foundational factors exist at the level of the global system. Some of them exist at the level of the European regional system, and some of them are peculiar to Ireland itself. At the global level, stagnant wages are an incredibly important factor in explaining the downturn. Productivity has been rising, wages have been stagnating, and consequently it's very difficult to sell the product. In this context, we have sluggish private investment, which is a consequence both of stagnant wages but also global excess capacity consequent on the integration of many previously semi-autonomous national markets. We have a hollowed-out state, unable to pick up the slack, and unregulated private finance, and I don't have to go into the consequences of that particularly. At the European level, we have a currency union without a transfer union, that is, without the fiscal arrangements which would make such a currency union genuinely workable. We have a dysfunctional European Central Bank, which is both unwilling and statutorily precluded from taking many of the necessary actions to address the crisis on the European level. In Ireland, we didn't have stagnant wages, but we did have rising inequality. We have astonishing debt levels, which has been talked about fairly extensively over the course of the last 2 days, and we're saddled with a low tax regime. These institutional factors contributed to the crisis, and it's resolving these institutional factors which is absolutely essential to moving out of the long-term crisis. So that what's needed is rising wages, increased public investment to take up the slack from stagnant private investment, a larger, more activist state. Public banking eventually is probably in this crisis, I think, going to have to substantially replace private banking. We've invested a heck of a lot of money in an effort to save private banking, and it still hasn't worked. At the level of Europe, and I deliberately choose the sort of scary phrase, transfer union, I think we may as well confront it. And what we need is a transfer union or no euro. Okay, so I'm not against the euro, but if the European system is unwilling to make the euro work, the only alternative is no euro. The ECB has to undertake employment as well as inflation as one of its key priorities. This isn't actually terribly radical. The US Federal Reserve is supposed to both fight inflation and preserve employment. What we have is a kind of hyper-neoliberal central bank which only has 1/2 of its mandate. In Ireland, we have to address the equality issue. We definitively have to write down debt. This has to take place at the European level as well. And we need to break with the low tax regime, with taxes on wealth and high income. And Neri can tell you a good deal more about that than I can. If Plan A doesn't work, the alphabet has 25 more letters. We're in a long period of economic crisis. It's unlikely that any Plan A was going to work. It's even less likely that the current Plan A is going to work. We're going to be forced to consider much more ambitious, much more radical restructurings before this crisis is over. Thank you.